The heavy, metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place was the exact sound of Maya's future being stolen. It was a sharp, unforgiving noise that echoed off the damp concrete walls of the soundproof basement archives. A second later, the muffled, rhythmic thumping of heavy bass drifted down through the floorboards. Upstairs, 2 floors above her makeshift prison, a string quartet was likely playing. Champagne was flowing into crystal flutes, and the New York elite were gathering in the grand ballroom of her family's estate. It was a lavish gala thrown for one singular purpose: to secure a multi-billion-dollar merger with Julian Cross. Maya pressed her palms flat against the cold, unyielding steel of the basement door, her breathing shallow and frantic. She had tried everything. She had thrown her entire body weight against the frame until her shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. She had screamed until her throat was raw, her voice shredding itself against the heavy, sound-dampening insulation her late father had installed years ago to protect his most sensitive servers. Nobody could hear her. Nobody was coming. She slowly slid down the door, pulling her knees to her chest as the chilled air of the archives seeped through her thin cotton t-shirt. This wasn't just a corporate takeover. It was a carefully orchestrated execution of her life's work. Upstairs, standing under the glittering chandeliers, was her stepsister, Chloe, and Chloe was wearing Maya's dress. It was a custom, emerald green silk gown Maya had saved up for months to buy, chosen specifically because he had once mentioned, in a late-night message, that green was his favorite color. But Chloe hadn't just stolen Maya's dress. She had stolen her identity. For the past 8 months, Maya had been the sole architect of a groundbreaking artificial intelligence algorithm. It was a predictive, adaptive code that her father had dreamed of before his sudden passing, a project he had left in her capable, brilliant hands. But since his death, her stepmother, Evelyn, had systematically dismantled his tech legacy, treating Maya not as a grieving daughter, but as a liability, an uncredited ghost in her own company. Maya had retreated into the code, and in the digital shadows of a highly secure, elite developer forum, she had found him. J.C. At first, their anonymous correspondence had been purely professional, sparring over clean code, theoretical algorithms, and the future of machine learning. But the late-night debates had slowly shifted. They began talking about art, about grief, about the terrifying weight of expectation. Julian had stripped away her defenses, phrase by phrase, until she was laying her soul bare on a backlit screen at 3 a.m. He had fallen for her brilliant mind, her razor-sharp wit, and her deeply guarded heart. And she, entirely unaware that the man behind the screen was New York's most ruthless venture capitalist, had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with him. Tonight was supposed to be the reveal. Tonight, Julian Cross was coming to finalize the acquisition of the algorithm, and Maya was finally going to step out of the shadows, wear the green dress, and introduce herself to the man who already held her heart. Instead, Evelyn had ambushed her in the hallway an hour before the gala. "You really think a man like Julian Cross wants a socially awkward basement dweller?" Evelyn's sickly sweet voice echoed in Maya's memory, dripping with venom as she snatched the presentation tablet from Maya's hands. "Chloe is the face this company needs. She's beautiful. She's polished. And thanks to your little notes, She knows just enough to close the deal. You're staying down here until the ink is dry. A fresh wave of panic hit Maya, crashing over her like a physical blow. She clutched at her chest, her fingers digging into the fabric of her shirt as her lungs fought for air. The anxiety attack tore through her. A blinding, suffocating wave of loss. She was losing her father all over again. She was losing the code that felt like a piece of her own soul. And she was losing Julian to a girl who didn't even know how to write a basic command script. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, forcing herself to count her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She had to ground herself. She had to think. Her eyes snapped open. Adjusting to the dim emergency lights of the server room, the air conditioning unit hummed loudly in the corner. The HVAC system, the main intake vent for the estate's central air, was located just above the server rack, connecting directly to the grand office on the ground floor, the exact room Evelyn would use to host a private meeting with a billionaire. Scrambling to her feet, Maya ignored the burning ache in her shoulder and climbed onto the reinforced metal shelving. She wedged herself between a stack of dormant hard drives and the ceiling, pressing her ear directly against the cold metal grating of the vent. At first, there was only the hum of rushing air. Then, the distinct sound of heavy oak doors clicking shut. The ambient noise of the party vanished, replaced by the crisp, terrifyingly clear acoustics of her father's old office. Mr. Cross, I cannot tell you what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to our home. Evelyn's voice drifted through the metal grate, artificially sweet and practiced. We are thrilled to finalize this partnership. Maya stopped breathing. Let's skip the pleasantries. Evelyn, the voice that carried through the vent, was deep, resonant, and coated in a layer of absolute, uncompromising authority. Even through the aluminum ductwork, the sheer magnetism of Julian Cross's tone sent a shiver down Maya's spine. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders, to breaking companies apart and building empires from the rubble. Yet, beneath the corporate armor, Maya recognized the familiar cadence. It was him, the man who had sent her a message just yesterday saying, I can't wait to finally look you in the eyes. Of course, Mr. Cross. Evelyn stammered, clearly thrown by his abruptness. I'd like to formally introduce the genius behind the Elysium project, my daughter, Chloe. There was a pause, a heavy, suffocating silence that stretched so long Maya's nails bit into her own palms. She pictured Chloe, standing there in the emerald silk dress, wearing her most practiced, innocent smile. You're the anonymous architect, Julian said. His words weren't a question. They were a flat, assessing statement. I am, Chloe replied, her voice trembling slightly with a feigned modesty she always used to manipulate men. It's been quite a journey, keeping my identity hidden on the forum, but I wanted the work to speak for itself. Before you knew? Well, before you knew who I was. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, a tear hot and angry escaping down her cheek. It was a perfect line. Evelyn had undoubtedly rehearsed it with her. The work speaks volumes. Julian replied, his tone unreadable. Your algorithm is elegant. It's ruthless in its efficiency. But what fascinated me most wasn't the code. It was our conversations. I enjoyed them very much. Julian, Chloe purred, dropping his formal title to feign intimacy. Did you? The temperature in the office seemed to drop, the chill bleeding straight through the vent and into Maya's bones. Because the woman I've been speaking to for the last 8 months has a mind unlike anyone I've ever encountered. She doesn't just write predictive models. She understands the human condition. Maya pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle a quiet sob. He remembered. He saw her. I try to put my heart into everything I do, Chloe offered, a slight edge of panic bleeding into her smooth delivery. Then indulge me. Chloe, Julian said softly. The quietness of his voice was a warning. The sound of a predator circling its prey. 2 weeks ago, we were discussing the ethical boundaries of AI predictive grief modeling. It was 3 in the morning. I asked you a very specific question. Do you remember what it was? Silence. In the basement. Maya mouthed the words she had typed that night. We discussed so many things. Julian. Chloe laughed nervously, the sound shrill and grating. Late night fatigue. You know how it is. My memory is a bit blurry on the exact phrasing. Let me refresh your memory. Julian's voice turned to steel. I asked you, can a machine ever truly understand the weight of human grief? Or does it only mimic the arithmetic of loss? Maya's heart hammered furiously against her ribs. She remembered sitting in the dark, tears streaming down her face as she thought of her father, before her fingers flew across the keyboard to type her reply. Right, of course. Chloe scrambled, completely unaware of the trap closing around her. And I told you that a machine can learn anything if the dataset is large enough. That grief is just another metric we can calculate. A devastating, absolute silence filled the room. Maya closed her eyes. It was the exact opposite of what she had told him. She had told him that grief was the one variable a machine could never calculate. Because love, in its purest form, breaks all the rules of logic. I see, Julian said. The sound of a heavy glass tumbler being placed onto a wooden desk echoed through the vent. You didn't write this code, Julian said, his voice dead cold, stripped of any polite pretense. It was the voice of a billionaire who was about to dismantle a life. You didn't write a single line of it. And you are certainly not the woman I have been speaking to. Mr. Cross. I can assure you, Evelyn began, her voice shrill with rising terror. Shut up. The command cracked like a whip. You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me who wrote the Elysium Project, and who you are covering for. And if you lie to me, Evelyn, I will freeze every asset you own before you can even draw your next breath. Where is she? The silence that followed Julian's demand was absolute. Through the metal grate of the air vent, Maya held her breath, her chest aching with the effort of remaining perfectly still. I don't know what you mean, Evelyn stammered, her voice thin and reedy. Completely stripped of its former arrogant polish. Don't play games with me. Julian's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. It was the sound of a man who dismantled Fortune 500 companies before his morning coffee. You presented a forgery. You dressed your daughter up in someone else's intellect. The woman who actually wrote that code. The woman I have spent the last 8 months speaking to every single night. She is here. I can feel it in the way you're shaking. Evelyn, where is she? She's indisposed. A troubled girl, become... Really? Maya doesn't like crowds. Maya. He heard her name. Evelyn had slipped. Maya. Julian repeated. The way he said her name like a reverence, like a sudden, striking revelation made Maya's breath catch painfully in her throat. Mr. Cross. Please. Let's just discuss the merger. The merger is dead. Julian snapped. The violent scrape of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back echoed through the vent. And if you've locked her away in this house, so are you. Maya scrambled down from the metal shelving. Her legs trembling so violently, she nearly collapsed onto the dusty concrete. She stood a few feet from the reinforced steel door, her heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, waiting in the dim, chilled air of the archives. From the stairwell outside, she heard it. Footsteps. They weren't the measured, calculated strides of a billionaire CEO walking through a polished corporate lobby. They were heavy, fast, and driven by a raw, unyielding urgency. He was taking the concrete steps, 2 at a time. Maya, his voice bled through the thick steel. It wasn't formal or composed. It was desperate. I'm here, she cried out, her voice raw and breaking. Tears instantly blurring her vision. I'm locked in. Step back from the door, Julian commanded. The sheer, authoritative force of his voice left no room for argument. Maya scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the cold metal of the server racks, her hands covering her mouth. Outside, Julian Cross didn't waste time looking for a key. He didn't go back upstairs to demand the electronic passcode from a terrified Evelyn. He didn't operate on anyone else's timeline. And his protective instincts had completely overridden his corporate restraint. Through the thick door, Maya heard the distinct, heavy clatter of the emergency fire extinguisher being ripped violently from its metal bracket on the wall. Crash. The first blow hit the electronic keypad with the force of a wrecking ball. The heavy metal door shuddered in its frame. Crash. Plastic shattered. Sparks hissed and popped loudly in the stairwell as the internal wiring of the biometric lock was brutally severed. Crash. With a final, devastating swing, the locking mechanism gave way. The heavy deadbolt, the one that had sealed Maya's fate just an hour ago, was utterly obliterated. Julian didn't just unlock her prison, he destroyed it. The heavy steel door groaned on its hinges as it was shoved open, and light from the stairwell flooded the dim basement. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh fluorescent glare. Julian Cross was a man who commanded the gravity of any room he entered. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His dark, custom-tailored suit, a stark contrast to the dust and grime of the basement corridor. His chest heaved with physical exertion, his silk tie slightly loosened, and his dark eyes swept the shadows of the room with the frantic intensity of a man searching for his missing half. His gaze locked onto hers. Maya stood frozen against the server racks. She knew exactly how she looked. She was wearing a cheap, faded cotton sundress she usually wore to paint the house. Her hair was a tangled mess spilling over her shoulders. Her face was streaked with dust and terrified tears, and her knuckles were bruised from pounding on the door. She was the absolute antithesis of the polished, flawless elite he spent his life surrounded by. But as Julian looked at her, the feral tension in his jaw vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, breath-stealing awe. He took a slow step into the room, tossing the dented fire extinguisher aside. It clattered loudly against the concrete, but neither of them flinched. The basement was completely silent, save for their ragged breathing. Julian stopped mere inches from her. He looked down into her eyes, searching her face, needing absolute, undeniable certainty. Can a machine ever truly understand the weight of human grief? He asked. His voice was a raspy, breathless whisper. Stripped of all its armor, Maya looked up into eyes that were dark, piercing, and entirely focused on her. Her voice shook, but the words were a fierce, undeniable truth. No, she answered, the tears finally spilling over her lashes and tracking through the dust on her cheeks. Because grief isn't arithmetic. It's love with nowhere to go. And love breaks every rule of logic. A ragged exhale tore from Julian's chest. The last fraction of a barrier between them disintegrated into dust. He dropped to his knees, right there on the dirty concrete floor, bringing himself down to her eye level as she shrank against the metal racks. His large, warm hands reached out, trembling slightly, and gently cupped her face. His thumbs brushed away the tear tracks on her cheeks with a devastating tenderness that completely wrecked her remaining composure. It's you, he breathed, his voice breaking. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as a shudder of pure, overwhelming relief went through his massive frame. God, Maya, I finally found you. The physical chemistry of that single touch was instantaneous and electric. It was a jolt of pure, crackling energy that bypassed her skin and settled directly in the center of her chest. For 8 months, they had connected mind to mind, pouring their souls out into the digital ether. But this, the heat of his palms against her jaw, the scent of expensive cedar and bergamot radiating from his skin, the solid, protective weight of his presence solidified the connection into something real, something permanent, and utterly consuming. They locked you down here, Julian growled, his eyes snapping open. The tenderness in his gaze shifted instantly into a dark, possessive fury. They took your life's work, and they threw you in the dark. They needed the merger, Maya whispered, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his thick wrists. Evelyn said, I wasn't the face you wanted for the company. Julian stood up, his hands shifting to her waist to pull her up with him. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his bespoke Tom Ford suit jacket, a garment worth more than everything Maya currently owned, and draped it gently over her trembling shoulders. The heavy, silk-lined fabric swallowed her, cocooning her in his warmth. Evelyn is about to learn exactly what happens when you try to steal from me, Julian said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet octave. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip firm, grounding, and unapologetically possessive. Come with me. He led her out of the basement and up the stairs. Maya's legs felt like lead, but Julian's presence was a steady, unmovable force pulling her upward toward the light. The gala in the grand ballroom was in full swing when they reached the ground floor. The string quartet was playing a lively, elegant waltz, and the room was a sea of designer gowns, flowing champagne, and quiet, calculated corporate networking. Julian didn't bother opening the ornate double doors quietly. He shoved them open with enough force that they slammed back against the walls like a gunshot. The music stopped abruptly. Conversations died in the throats of New York's elite. Every single eye in the opulent room turned to the entrance. It was a scene of perfect, orchestrated chaos. Julian Cross, the most powerful man in the city, stood in the doorway in his crisp white shirt sleeves, his expression a mask of absolute, terrifying rage. And tucked intimately against his side, swallowed in his suit jacket, was the forgotten stepdaughter in a dusty, cheap dress, Evelyn and Chloe, who had been holding court near the towering champagne fountain, froze. All the blood drained from Chloe's perfectly contoured face. She looked down at the custom emerald silk gown she wore, Maya's gown, and physically shrank back under Julian's lethal glare. "Mr. Cross," Evelyn gasped, stepping forward, her practiced, high society smile trembling violently. "Please, whatever misunderstanding has occurred down there, we can resolve it privately. There is no misunderstanding." "Evelyn," Julian's voice boomed, carrying effortlessly to every corner of the dead silent ballroom. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The sheer, authoritative weight of his tone commanded absolute submission from the room. "You have committed corporate fraud. You stole the proprietary intellectual property of the Elysium Project from its sole, brilliant creator, Maya Vance. And you imprisoned her in a basement to cover your tracks." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Tech investors, board members, and wealthy socialites stared in stunned, horrified disbelief. "She's lying," Chloe cried out, her voice shrill and desperate as the wealthy men around her began to step away. "Julian, she's mentally unstable. She doesn't know anything about the code." Julian didn't even dignify Chloe with a look. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number with his thumb, while his other arm remained tightly anchored around Maya's waist. Pulling her flush against his side, he put the phone on speaker, holding it up for the entire room to hear. "Marcus," Julian said, his dark eyes locked dead on Evelyn's pale, terrified face. "Yes, Mr. Cross," his chief legal counsel's voice echoed crisply through the ballroom. "The Vance merger is terminated," Julian ordered, his tone utterly merciless. "Execute the hostile takeover protocols we prepped for a contingency. Initiate the forensic audit on Evelyn Vance's personal accounts and freeze her corporate assets immediately. I want the injunctions filed before midnight. Bury them. Understood." "Sir, it's done." The phone clicked off. Evelyn let out a choked, devastated sob, her knees visibly buckling as the realization hit her. In less than 60 seconds, Julian Cross had just legally and financially obliterated her entire empire. The stolen tech legacy was gone. The money was gone. Her social standing was completely, irreparably shattered in front of everyone who mattered. Julian slipped his phone back into his pocket. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the shock of witnessing a billionaire enact total, unapologetic ruin. He turned slightly, ensuring his broad body shielded Maya from the gaping stares of the crowd. He looked down at her, the dangerous, violent edge in his eyes softening entirely the moment his gaze met hers. Then, he looked back at the ruined stepfamily, his arm tightening possessively around Maya's waist. anchoring her to him in a way that told the entire room, without a single doubt, that she belonged to him. "This woman is the only asset in this building I care about," Julian stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable finality. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for apologies or explanations. Julian turned, pulling Maya seamlessly into his side, and guided her out of the ballroom and into the New York night, leaving the shattered remains of her abusers' lives in the dust. The ride to Julian's penthouse was a blur of neon city lights and the quiet, powerful purr of his private car. Neither of them spoke. Julian kept her tucked firmly against his side in the leather back seat, his arm a heavy, protective band around her shoulders, shielding her from the chaotic aftermath of the gala. When the private elevator doors finally slid open, revealing the sprawling expanse of his penthouse, the absolute silence of the space hit Maya like a physical weight. It was a fortress of glass, dark steel, and deep, masculine tones, suspended high above the glittering Manhattan skyline. It was a sanctuary, completely insulated from the cruelty and noise of the world below. As the adrenaline that had sustained her through the rescue finally began to evaporate, a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion took its place. She stood in the massive foyer, the oversized weight of Julian's bespoke suit jacket still draped over her small, shivering frame, feeling entirely unmoored. The reality of the night was crashing down on her. She had lost the only family she had left, but she had been found by the one man who actually knew her soul. Julian didn't push. The ruthless, terrifying billionaire who had just dismantled an empire with a single phone call vanished, replaced by a man of breathtaking gentleness. He guided her past the sweeping living room and into a sprawling, marble-clad master bathroom that looked like a private spa. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. He stepped past her and turned on the brass fixtures, filling the massive, sunken, soaking tub with steaming water. "Let's get the dust off you. Let's wash this night away." Maya clutched the lapels of his jacket, her knuckles white. I don't know what happens now. Julian, my entire life just got ripped apart in 10 minutes. Right now, you just breathe," Julian said softly. He turned to face her, keeping a respectful distance, his dark eyes radiating a steadying warmth. "Maya, I want to help you. I want to take care of you, but only if you want me to. May I?" The explicit request for her consent, the total relinquishment of his formidable control to her, made a fresh, hot tear slip down her dirt-streaked cheek. She nodded. Julian helped her out of the ruined, dusty sundress with the absolute reverence of a man handling priceless art. When she slipped into the hot, jasmine-scented water, the heat immediately sank into her chilled bones, and she let out a long, shuddering sigh. Julian rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, exposing his thick, corded forearms. He knelt beside the tub on the hard marble floor, uncaring of his expensive clothes, and gently worked the rich lather of shampoo into her scalp. His large, warm fingers massaged away the physical ache of the basement. But it was his solid, grounding presence that began to heal her deeper wounds. "My father built that server room," she whispered, the confession spilling out into the quiet steam of the bathroom, her eyes fluttering shut beneath his touch. He used to tell me that code was just logic, trying to make sense of a chaotic world. When he died, Evelyn made me feel like I was the chaotic part. Like I was a glitch. I spent the last 2 years feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. Julian's hands paused in her hair. He leaned closer, his chest brushing the edge of the tub, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a fierce intensity that made her breath catch. You were never a ghost, Maya. For 8 months, you were the most real thing in my entire life. Every night, sitting alone in my office, reading your words, debating with you, laughing with you, you anchored me. They tried to lock you in the dark, to steal your brilliance. But you are the brightest mind and the most beautiful soul I have ever known. I see you. Maya, I have always seen you. An hour later, with the dust and the trauma of the evening washed down the drain, Maya stepped out of the bathroom. She was wearing one of Julian's oversized, white, Egyptian, cotton, button-down shirts. The impossibly soft fabric swallowed her small frame, the hem hitting mid-thigh. The sleeves rolled up past her wrists. It smelled intensely of hemp cedar, bergamot, and the crisp scent of raw power. Catching her reflection in the hallway mirror, she paused. Her skin was flushed. Her dark hair fell in damp, clean waves around her shoulders. And for the first time in years, the haunted look in her eyes was gone. She walked quietly into the dimly lit living room. Julian was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the sprawling, glittering grid of New York City. He had discarded his tie, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt were undone, revealing a glimpse of the hard, tanned skin of his chest. A heavy crystal glass of amber liquid was forgotten in his hand. The moonlight caught the sharp, aristocratic angles of his jaw. He looked like a king, surveying his empire. Utterly untouchable, yet, the moment he heard the soft pad of her bare feet against the hardwood floor, he turned. His entire focus narrowed solely, completely, to her. The air in the vast room instantly thickened. The tender, comforting atmosphere of the bathroom evaporated in a split second, replaced by a heavy, crackling tension that made the tiny hairs on the back of Maya's neck stand up. He looked at her, really looked at her standing in his clothes, illuminated by the city lights. His dark eyes dilated. Ra. Primal hunger bleeding straight through his ironclad corporate control. But he didn't move toward her. He stayed rooted to the spot, his breathing turning slightly shallower. Letting her set the pace. For the first time in her life, Maya didn't want to hide in the shadows. She wanted to step into the light. She wanted him. She crossed the vast expanse of the living room, her heart hammering a frantic, thrilling rhythm against her ribs. When she reached him, she didn't hesitate. Maya reached up, her small hands sliding over the broad, hard expanse of his chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thud of his heartbeat beneath the fabric. She tipped her chin up, closed her eyes, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was the spark that ignited a powder keg. With a low, feral groan that vibrated deep in his chest, Julian's restraint snapped completely. His arms wrapped around her, hauling her flush against his solid, muscular body. The glass in his hand clattered onto a side table, the expensive scotch splashing unheeded, as his fingers tangled fiercely in her damp hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss. It wasn't gentle anymore. It was a consuming, desperate claim. His mouth devoured hers, hot and demanding, tasting of scotch and untamed. Long-denied desire, Maya gasped into his mouth, rising onto her toes, her hands desperately gripping his broad shoulders to anchor herself. The sheer, overwhelming physical power of him enveloped her. Every nerve ending in her body sang with electric heat. Waking up from a 2-year slumber, Maya, he rasped against her lips, his voice ragged, bordering on a prayer as his lips trailed a blazing path down her jaw to the sensitive column of her throat. God, you are so breathtaking. Tell me to stop. Tell me right now, or I won't be able to. Don't, she breathed, her head falling back to give him better access, her hands sliding up into his thick, dark hair, pulling him closer. Don't you dare stop. Julian, I want you. Julian swept her off her feet in a single, fluid motion. Maya gasped as the world tilted, wrapping her legs instinctively around his narrow waist as he carried her down the hall and into the cavernous master bedroom. He laid her back against the cool, dark silk of his bedsheets, following her down immediately, covering her body with the heavy, magnificent weight of his own. He kissed her jaw, her throat, the sensitive skin just below her ear, eliciting a soft, helpless moan from her lips that only fueled his urgency. His hands were everywhere worshipful, possessive, branding her skin with his touch. He undid the buttons of the oversized shirt with deft, impatient fingers, pushing the soft cotton aside to bear her to his gaze. Julian pulled back just enough to look at her, his broad chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a mixture of profound reverence and raw lust. He didn't look at her like she was just a brilliant coder, and he certainly didn't look at her like she was the broken girl from the basement. He looked at her like she was a queen who had just fallen into his bed, like a treasure he had spent his entire life searching for. Mina, he murmured fiercely, his thumb tracing the delicate curve of her collarbone, his voice thick with emotion. You belong with me. Here, in the light. I've got you. Maya, you're safe. When they finally came together, it was a collision of two souls that had known each other in the dark and were finally meeting in the physical world. It was intense, fieri, and deeply, achingly emotional. With every slow, deep thrust, with every ragged breath and whispered praise, Julian systematically stripped away the years of neglect and invisibility Evelyn had forced upon her. He worshipped her body with a devastating combination of ruthless passion and absolute, unyielding devotion, drawing out her pleasure until she was thrashing and crying out his name. He made her feel beautiful, cherished, and entirely, irrevocably wanted. As Maya shattered, a beautiful, blinding release washing over her. She clung to his broad shoulders, tears of pure, overwhelming joy slipping from her eyes. Julian followed her over the edge a second later. A harsh, guttural shout tearing from his throat as he buried his face in the crook of her neck. In the quiet aftermath, as their breathing slowly returned to normal, Julian pulled her tightly against his chest, wrapping his arms around her and pulling the heavy silk duvet over them both. He pressed a lingering, tender kiss to her forehead, his heartbeat thundering a steady, comforting rhythm against hers. Lying there in the safety of his arms, surrounded by the impenetrable fortress he had built, Maya closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she finally knew what it felt like to be home. 3 months had passed since the night the reinforced door of the basement had been shattered, and the transformation in Maya Vance was nothing short of breathtaking. She was no longer just managing her new life, she was absolutely thriving. Gone was the scared, downtrodden girl in the dusty dress who had been locked away in the dark. In her place stood a woman who dressed in immaculate, tailored designer suits. With her head held high and an unshakable confidence in her bearing, Maya wasn't just Julian Cross's partner behind the closed doors of his penthouse. She was his absolute equal in the cutthroat world of venture capitalism. Julian had carved out an entire tech division for her at Cross Industries, giving her full autonomous control over the Elysium project, and she commanded it with a brilliance that left his senior staff in awe. She walked through the gleaming glass corridors of the corporate headquarters, not as a charity case or a billionaire's fleeting distraction, but as a titan in her own right. But the true magic of their relationship wasn't found in the boardroom. It was found in the quiet, everyday moments that proved they were building something permanent. Their connection had evolved into a relationship based on genuine care, profound respect, and a deeply rooted, growing love. It wasn't a trauma bond born from a dramatic rescue. It was a true partnership. It was found in the sun-drenched kitchen of the penthouse on a Tuesday morning, where Julian, still in his sweatpants and a rumpled t-shirt, would wrap his arms around her waist while she brewed her absurdly complicated pour-over coffee. It was the way he rested his chin on her shoulder, murmuring sleep-rough praises into her neck while she playfully swatted his wandering hands away to check the morning market reports. It was the stolen, breathless moments in the private corporate elevator. The second the polished steel doors slid shut, cutting them off from the bustling office floors, the ruthless CEO would disappear. Julian would pin her gently against the mirrored wall, his mouth finding hers for a hot, urgent kiss that left her lips swollen and her pulse racing, only to step back and straighten his tie with a wicked smirk the second the bell dinged for the lobby. He made sure she knew, every single day, that he was entirely, hopelessly addicted to her. That intoxicating blend of professional respect and primal desire reached its boiling point on a crisp Thursday afternoon. Maya had just spent 2 grueling hours in the executive boardroom, defending the predictive ethical parameters of her AI algorithm against a notoriously hostile faction of legacy stakeholders. It was the corporate equivalent of walking into a lion's den. 3 months ago, the very thought of speaking in front of these aggressive, old money billionaires would have triggered a paralyzing anxiety attack. But today, Maya was a force of nature, standing at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a sleek, crimson power suit that hugged every curve. She verbally dismantled their archaic arguments with surgical precision. She was sharp, composed, and absolutely brilliant. She didn't just hold her ground, She dominated the room, forcing the lead detractor to concede to her highly favorable terms. Through it all, Julian sat near the back of the room, leaning back in his leather chair with his ankle resting on his knee. He didn't interrupt. He didn't step in to rescue her. He just watched her with dark, dilated eyes, his expression radiating a lethal mixture of profound pride and a dark, simmering hunger. He was looking at her the exact way a man looks at the woman he knows is entirely extraordinary. The second the meeting adjourned and the final stakeholder filed out of the room, Julian stood up. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, plunging the boardroom into a sudden, charged silence. "My brilliant Maya," Julian murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration that sent an immediate shiver down her spine. He began walking slowly down the length of the table toward her, stripping off his suit jacket and tossing it carelessly over a chair. Maya leaned her hips back against the edge of the mahogany table, her heart suddenly pounding a different kind of rhythm. "I told you I had the data to back up the projections," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though a confident, breathless smile tugged at her lips. "You didn't just back them up, you annihilated him," Julian said, closing the distance between them. His hands came down flat on the table on either side of her hips, trapping her in a cage of hard muscle and radiating heat. "Watching you tear that arrogant prick apart? God!" "Maya, do you have any idea what it does to me when you own a room like that?" He didn't give her a chance to answer. Julian's mouth crashed down on hers. Fierce and uninhibited, this wasn't the tender, worshipping kiss from their first night in the penthouse. This was pure, volatile combustion. The adrenaline from the high-stakes meeting bled directly into their physical chemistry, igniting a feral, demanding passion that swept through Maya like wildfire. She didn't melt into him this time. She pushed back. Maya's hands grabbed the lapels of his crisp white shirt, pulling him aggressively against her, her mouth opening to match his dark, dominating energy. She bit his lower lip, drawing a harsh, guttural groan from deep in his chest. "Julian," she gasped as his mouth abandoned hers to blaze a hot, open mouth trail down her jaw and the sensitive column of her throat. With a swift, powerful motion, Julian gripped her waist and lifted her effortlessly, sitting her back onto the polished expanse of the boardroom table. Documents and high-level projection folders scattered to the floor. Forgotten, he stepped tightly between her thighs, his hands sliding up the smooth fabric of her crimson skirt, gripping her thighs with a possessive, bruising strength. "You are so damn powerful," he rasped, his breath hot against her skin as his hands pushed her skirt higher, his dark eyes blazing with unchecked desire. "You wear my ring. You run this empire with me. And you take exactly what you want. Tell me what you want right now. Maya. Tell me." The raw dominance in his voice was a challenge. One she was more than ready to meet. She tangled her fingers in his thick, dark hair, pulling his face back up to look him dead in the eye. Her gaze was fierce, unyielding, and completely stripped of fear. She was his equal in every conceivable way. "I want you to lock that door," Maya ordered, her voice dropping to a husky, commanding whisper that made his pupils blow wide. And then Julian let out a ragged, disbelieving laugh, a sound of pure masculine triumph and absolute surrender to her. He reached behind him without ever breaking eye contact, hitting the automated security button on the wall panel. The heavy lock on the boardroom doors clicked into place with a definitive, satisfying thud. "Your wish, Madam Executive," he growled darkly, leaning in to capture her lips again, "is my absolute command." The scene that followed was a masterclass in equal, explosive passion. Against the backdrop of the New York skyline, bathed in the afternoon sun filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, they stripped away the last remnants of corporate restraint. Julian was relentless and intense, driving her to the absolute edge of her sanity with a dominance that thrilled her to her core. But Maya met him blow for blow, matching his ferocious energy, her nails scoring down his back as she commanded his touch, pulling him deeper into the devastating heat of their connection. She wasn't a fragile thing to be protected anymore. She was a woman fully in her power, anchored by a man who worshipped the very strength he had helped her find. When they finally shattered, breathless and trembling against the polished wood of the boardroom table, Julian buried his face in the crook of her neck, his arms wrapping around her in a vice-like grip. "Mine," he breathed, the word a ragged, triumphant claim against her heated skin. "Yours," she agreed softly, her fingers tracing the hard line of his jaw. "And you are mine." He lifted his head, his chest heaving, a devastatingly handsome smile breaking across his sharp features. "Always, Maya, in every boardroom, in every lifetime, always." It was the ultimate realization of her journey. She had stepped out of the shadows, claimed her legacy, and found a love that didn't just save her, it empowered her to rule. The crisp autumn air of New York City whipped around them as Maya and Julian stepped out of the soaring glass lobby of Cross Industries. It had been a triumphant day, the kind that tasted of champagne and limitless possibilities. Julian's hand was a warm, anchoring presence at the small of her back as they moved toward the waiting sleek, black Maybach. But the shadows of the past have a way of clinging, refusing to let go without a final fight. "Maya," the voice was shrill, lacking its former polished arrogance, but it still made Maya's steps falter. Stepping out from the shadows of the corporate plaza was Evelyn. She looked haggard, wrapped in a designer coat from 3 seasons ago, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "Maya, please," Evelyn begged, rushing forward, though Julian's personal security team immediately materialized out of the dusk, blocking her path. "You have to tell him to call off the lawyers. They took everything. Maya, the house, the accounts. We have nothing left." Maya stared at the woman who had made 2 years of her life a living hell. She didn't feel fear anymore. She didn't even feel anger. She just felt an overwhelming sense of pity. "You took everything from me first, Evelyn," Maya said quietly, her voice perfectly even. "You stole my father's company. You stole my work. I gave you a roof over your head," Evelyn sneered, her desperation quickly curdling into familiar, toxic cruelty. "You were a charity case, a socially inept little freak who hid in a basement. You think you're so powerful now, You just got lucky that you spread your legs for a billionaire. You're still nobody without him. A dangerous, lethal growl vibrated deep in Julian's chest. His muscles coiled, his dark eyes flashing with a violent fury, ready to obliterate the woman standing before them. But before he could issue a command that would undoubtedly ruin Evelyn's life all over again, Maya gently placed a hand flat against his chest. She didn't need him to save her. Not anymore. Julian looked down at her, saw the absolute, unbreakable steel in her eyes, and slowly stepped back. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, a slow, incredibly proud smirk touching his lips as he let his queen hold her court. Maya stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and her stepmother. She was immaculate in her tailored suit, radiating the kind of effortless power that money couldn't buy. I am not a charity case, Evelyn, and I certainly didn't get lucky, Maya said, her voice dropping to a smooth, icy register that commanded absolute silence. I wrote the algorithm that revolutionized this industry. I secured the merger. And I did it all while you kept me locked in the dark. She tilted her head, her gaze pinning Evelyn in place. I built my own empire. You just tried to rent space in it. Never approach me again. Evelyn's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The gaslighting, the manipulation it had all bounced off Maya's armor like paper bullets. Maya turned her back on her stepmother, effectively erasing her from her world, and walked to the waiting car. The heavy, armored door of the Maybach clicked shut, sealing them in the quiet, luxurious sanctuary of the back seat. As the car smoothly merged into the glittering Manhattan traffic, Maya let out a long exhale, feeling the last remaining knot of tension dissolve from her shoulders. She turned to Julian, expecting a quip or a protective embrace. Instead, she found him staring at her with an expression of such profound, devastating reverence that it stole her breath. He wasn't just looking at the woman he desired, he was looking at his absolute equal. You. Julian breathed, his voice rough with emotion. Are the most magnificent creature on this earth. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, matte black velvet box. Maya's heart executed a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. When he flipped it open, she didn't see a gaudy, ostentatious diamond meant to show ownership. It was a flawless, emerald-cut diamond, set in a modern, elegant, platinum band. It was a promise of partnership. Julian didn't get down on one knee. He didn't need to. He shifted closer, taking her hand in his thumb tracing her knuckles. I don't want to own you, Maya. I want to build a world with you, Julian said softly, his dark eyes entirely captivated. I fell in love with your mind in the dark, Maya, but watching you shine in the light is the greatest privilege of my life. Marry me. Be my partner, my equal, and my wife. Tears pricked Maya's eyes, but this time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She looked at the man who had torn down a door to find her, and then looked at the brilliant future stretching out before them. Yes, she whispered, leaning in to press her lips against his. Yes, Julian, always. Sometimes, the hardest part of being locked in the dark is learning to trust the light. But when you find the person who helps you break the door off its hinges, you don't just step into the light, you own it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you loved Maya and Julian's journey from the shadows to the top of the empire, please hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and it helps bring more passionate, high-stakes romances right to your feed. Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next story.